The billionaire had already reached for the door when the janitor suddenly stepped in front of her, dropped his mop, and shouted the one thing nobody in the building had ever dared to say to her: "Don't move. Don't speak." For one frozen second, Vivienne Caldwell stared at the ordinary man blocking her path, unable to understand why a janitor would risk his job, his dignity, and perhaps his entire future to stop her. Then she noticed what he had seen. Her right hand was trembling. Her breathing had become strangely shallow. And beneath the polished marble floor, something was making a faint clicking sound. If this story reminds you that kindness can come from the most unexpected person, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing stories of kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances to our community. Vivienne Caldwell was 39 years old and the founder of Caldwell Meridian, a technology and real estate empire that had transformed half of the city skyline. Newspapers described her as brilliant, disciplined, fearless, and nearly impossible to impress. She had learned early in life that money could solve almost every practical problem, but she had never learned how to make grief disappear. 3 years earlier, she had lost her younger brother, Everett, in an accident that had left a permanent emptiness inside her. Since then, Vivienne had built walls around herself so high that even the people closest to her rarely knew what she was feeling. That afternoon, she had arrived at the company's newest headquarters to inspect the final preparations before a major investor presentation. The building was filled with executives, architects, lawyers, and contractors, all moving quickly beneath bright daytime sunlight pouring through enormous glass windows. Everyone seemed nervous about pleasing Vivienne. Everyone except one man. His name was Graham Mercer, a 46-year-old janitor who had worked at the building for 11 months. Graham was the kind of person most wealthy people never noticed. He wore a neatly pressed gray uniform, kept his equipment spotless, and moved quietly through hallways while important people hurried past him. But Graham had once lived a very different life. Before becoming a janitor, he had worked as a maintenance supervisor for a large construction company. He had known electrical systems, ventilation, structural safety, and emergency procedures better than most people realized. But after his wife died suddenly from an illness, Graham became the sole father of his 9-year-old daughter, Maisie. He had struggled to balance grief, childcare, bills, and work. Eventually, he had lost his old position because he could no longer accept unpredictable hours and constant travel. He never complained about it. Every morning, he woke before sunrise, packed Maisie's lunch, made sure she had clean clothes for school, and went to work determined to give his daughter the one thing he had promised her: stability. That afternoon, Graham had been cleaning the executive corridor when he noticed something unusual. A contractor had recently installed a decorative wall near the private elevator, and while wiping dust from the floor, Graham heard a faint mechanical clicking beneath the marble. It was irregular, but familiar. He crouched down and pressed his palm against the floor. A subtle vibration traveled through his fingers. His construction experience immediately told him something was wrong. He reported it to a nearby supervisor, but the supervisor was distracted by the arrival of Vivienne and brushed him aside, assuming it was part of the elevator system. Graham did not argue. He simply watched. Minutes later, Vivienne stepped out of the elevator carrying a tablet and a folder. Several executives followed her, eager to discuss the afternoon presentation. She walked toward the conference room without noticing the janitor standing several yards away. Graham, however, noticed the clicking had become faster. He looked at the marble floor, then at the wall, and suddenly remembered something from the building's original maintenance plans. A temporary electrical control system had been installed during construction. If someone had connected the wrong circuit behind the decorative wall, an electrical surge could travel through the elevator controls and the metal framework beneath the corridor. The situation might be harmless, or it could become catastrophic. Graham had no time to calculate the odds. Vivienne took another step. Graham dropped his mop. His voice broke across the polished hallway, startling everyone. "Don't move. Don't speak." The entire corridor fell silent. Vivienne turned slowly, her expression hardening. Nobody spoke to her that way. Security guards immediately moved forward, and one executive began demanding that Graham step aside. But Graham raised one hand and stared at the floor beneath Vivienne's feet. He could see a tiny spark flickering beneath a narrow gap in the marble. His heart pounded. He told everyone to move backward without touching the walls or elevator doors. Vivienne looked down and finally saw the faint flicker. For the first time in years, fear appeared plainly across her face. Graham immediately called building emergency services and ordered the nearby electrical system isolated. His calmness confused everyone. He did not behave like a frightened janitor. He behaved like someone who had faced dangerous situations before and knew exactly how quickly panic could make things worse. The building was evacuated from the affected corridor while technicians shut down the power. When they opened the decorative wall, they discovered a damaged control junction connected to an improperly installed electrical component. The fault had been creating intermittent arcing beneath the corridor. It had not yet caused a major fire, but the technicians confirmed that the system could have failed violently if the circuit had remained active. Vivienne stood several feet away, staring at the exposed wiring. Then she looked at Graham. The man who had just saved her life was quietly picking up his mop. He wasn't asking for praise. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't even asking whether his job was safe. He simply wanted to finish cleaning. Vivienne approached him, but Graham seemed uncomfortable with the attention. She thanked him, and he nodded politely. When she asked how he had known what to do, he explained that he had worked in construction maintenance for many years before becoming a janitor. He had recognized the sound and vibration. Vivienne asked why he had not immediately called security. Graham hesitated before admitting that he had tried to warn the supervisor first, but nobody had listened. Those words stayed with Vivienne. Nobody had listened. She had spent years surrounded by people who listened to every word she said, yet she had rarely stopped to listen to people beneath her. The incident should have ended there, but later that afternoon Vivienne learned something else. Graham had missed part of his daughter's school event because of the emergency. He was worried that Maisie would think he had forgotten her. Vivienne expected him to be angry about losing that precious moment. Instead, he simply said that his daughter had learned long ago that sometimes her father had to help people, and he hoped she would understand. That sentence struck Vivienne harder than any business failure ever had. She asked Graham where his daughter was. He showed her a photograph on his phone. Maisie was smiling beside a small homemade science project, wearing oversized safety goggles. Vivienne noticed the pride in Graham's face as he looked at the picture. It was a pride she had not felt in herself for years. The next morning, Vivienne arrived at the building earlier than usual. She found Graham cleaning the lobby while Maisie sat nearby finishing her homework before school. Vivienne learned that Graham had no reliable childcare during certain mornings, so he sometimes brought his daughter with him before school began. Instead of criticizing him, Vivienne sat beside Maisie and asked about the science project. Maisie eagerly explained that she wanted to become an engineer. Vivienne smiled. For the first time in years, the billionaire who owned entire buildings found herself fascinated by a child's dream. Over the following weeks, Vivienne began discovering uncomfortable truths about her own company. Graham's warning had not been the only thing people had ignored. Several maintenance employees had reported safety concerns, but their complaints had been buried under paperwork. Some workers were afraid to speak because they believed management cared more about deadlines than people. Vivienne was furious, but not at the workers. She was furious at herself. She realized that her obsession with perfection had created a culture where employees were afraid to tell her when something was wrong. She had believed that demanding excellence meant protecting the company. Instead, she had created silence. Graham became one of the people she listened to. He helped redesign the building's safety reporting system, not because he wanted a promotion, but because he believed workers should never have to choose between keeping their jobs and speaking up about danger. Vivienne offered him a management position in facilities safety, but Graham initially refused. He feared that he wasn't qualified enough. Vivienne reminded him that qualifications were not always written on paper. Sometimes they were earned through years of responsibility, failure, sacrifice, and courage. Eventually, Graham accepted. His life began changing slowly. The new position gave him better hours, a higher salary, and enough flexibility to spend more time with Maisie. But the greatest change wasn't financial. Graham began believing that the part of his life he had considered a failure had actually taught him something valuable. Vivienne changed too. She started visiting departments without announcing herself. She listened to employees. She learned their names. She apologized when she discovered that her decisions had caused unnecessary pressure. Some people were suspicious at first, believing the transformation would not last. But it did. Months later, Vivienne stood in the company's main lobby during a daytime employee gathering. She publicly announced a new safety initiative named in honor of the people who had the courage to speak up when nobody else was listening. She asked Graham to stand beside her. He looked embarrassed by the attention. Then Vivienne said something that surprised everyone. She explained that the most important person in her company that year had not been an executive, investor, architect, or lawyer. It had been a janitor who understood that a person's value was never determined by their job title. Graham looked toward Maisie. His daughter was smiling with tears in her eyes. Vivienne then handed Graham an envelope. Inside was not a bonus. It was a scholarship fund established for Maisie's future education, along with a commitment from the company to support educational opportunities for children of its employees. Graham immediately tried to refuse. Vivienne stopped him gently and explained that it wasn't charity. It was gratitude. For a moment, Graham couldn't speak. He had spent years believing that accepting help meant admitting he had failed. Now he understood that sometimes accepting kindness was simply another way of allowing someone else to be part of your life. Vivienne understood something too. She had spent years believing strength meant never needing anyone. But the janitor who had once stood in front of her and told her not to move had taught her the opposite. Real strength was knowing when to stop. Knowing when to listen. Knowing when to admit you were wrong. And knowing that the people society overlooked could sometimes be the very people who saved you. A year after the incident, Vivienne returned to the same corridor where Graham had stopped her. The marble floor had been replaced, the electrical system had been completely rebuilt, and the decorative wall was gone. In its place was a simple plaque honoring employees who had prevented accidents by speaking up. Graham was there with Maisie. Vivienne stood quietly beside them. She remembered the woman she had been that afternoon, powerful, wealthy, respected, and completely unaware of how much she had forgotten about being human. Then she looked at Graham and his daughter and realized that her life had not been saved merely because a janitor recognized a dangerous electrical fault. Her life had been saved because someone had cared enough to stop her. Someone who had nothing to gain. Someone who could have stayed silent. Someone who had every reason to believe that nobody important would listen. But he spoke anyway. And because he did, a billionaire learned that kindness does not always arrive wearing a suit. Sometimes it arrives in a worn uniform, carrying a mop, raising one trembling hand, and risking everything to protect a stranger. If you have ever experienced a moment when someone's unexpected kindness changed your life, leave a meaningful comment and tell us what that person taught you. Your story might give hope to someone reading it today. And if this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes the person we overlook is the person who sees what everyone else missed. Sometimes the voice we ignore is the voice that saves us. And sometimes the greatest second chance in life begins with something as simple as stopping, listening, and remembering that every human being, no matter their job, their wealth, or their position, deserves to be seen, heard, and valued. And that was the lesson Vivienne carried with her for the rest of her life. never be so powerful that you stop listening, never be so proud that you cannot accept forgiveness, and never be so busy looking upward that you fail to notice the person beside you who might be quietly holding the world together.